The smell hit her first. Cilantro and lime mixed with the metallic tang of stainless steel. Rosa's Cantina at 6 in the morning, before the lunch rush turned everything to chaos. Margaret Walsh pushed through the service entrance, her server's apron already tied around her waist, the fabric still damp from the morning she'd spent cleaning her apartment in silence. She'd been waiting tables here for 6 months. 6 months of invisibility, and that was exactly how she needed it. The restaurant was a study in controlled disorder. Maroon tile floors gleamed under fluorescent lights. Booth 7 sat empty by the window, the one with the torn vinyl seat that nobody wanted, except for the man who came every Thursday at 12:41 p.m., ordered carne asada with black beans, and never once looked at the menu. Margaret moved through the pre-service routine with the kind of precision that made the other servers look careless by comparison. She straightened the condiment station, grouping the salsa bottles by heat level, rotating the cream cheese from back to front, checking the lime wedges in their ice bath. Pain is information. She'd learned that 14 years ago in Kandahar. Here, pain was telling her that her left knee had locked again overnight, the one that never quite healed right. She didn't favor the left leg visibly. That would draw attention. Instead, she distributed her weight differently when she thought no one was watching, rolling her movements through her hips and core instead of her knees. When the plates clattered in the kitchen, and they always clattered, her shoulders didn't flinch. That was the test. The flinch meant you were still human. The flinch meant you still had something to lose. Gerald Pierce arrived at 6:02 a.m., exactly 40 minutes before opening, the way he did every morning. He wore a button-down shirt that cost more than Margaret's weekly rent, and his khakis had a crease sharp enough to cut. The general manager of Rosa's Cantina moved through the dining room like he owned it. He did, technically, or at least, he managed it with a kind of detail-obsessed tyranny that made the younger servers nervous and the older ones resentful. Margaret continued her work, wiping down the high-top tables, when Pierce stopped at the bar and watched her. She felt it. The weight of his attention. She'd felt that weight before, back when she wore a different uniform, when captaincy meant something more than knowing how to smile through a customer's complaint about lukewarm salsa. Margaret didn't turn. She just continued her work, her hands moving with the mechanical precision of someone who'd performed the same task 10,000 times. Muscle memory was a quiet thing. It didn't announce itself. Margaret. Pierce's voice came from the bar, smooth as oil. Those table legs need to be wiped down. The bottoms. Where the customer's feet go. I did them yesterday, Margaret said. The words came out exactly where they needed to, soft enough to be deferential, clear enough to be heard across the dining room. You did them yesterday. I'm asking you to do them today. Pierce smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. I like things a certain way here. Things done right. Standards. You understand. Of course. Margaret set down her rag, moved toward the supply closet. She understood perfectly. He was establishing a hierarchy. This was stage 1. She'd seen it before, though never from a man who managed a restaurant instead of a combat zone. 3 days earlier, on a Tuesday afternoon that had started like every other Tuesday, a man named Coleman had choked on his enchilada verde in booth 4. Margaret had been refilling waters 2 tables over. She'd seen his face change color, not a gasp, but the specific stillness that meant airway compromise, the kind of stillness that came right before panic. She'd moved without thinking. 16 years of training does that to you. It makes your body smarter than your mind. She'd moved to his table, asked him to stand, assessed the airway blockage with 2 fingers, determined it was a food particle lodged at the vallecula, applied upward thrusts at precisely the right angle, not pancaking the stomach, not fracturing ribs, just enough force to dislodge the particle. The enchilada chunk came up on the 3rd thrust. He'd gasped. His wife had cried. Another customer had started to clap before catching himself. Pierce had been at the front counter when it happened. He'd watched the whole thing. And when Margaret had handed off the patient to another server and returned to her section to finish her shift, Pierce had cornered her in the kitchen, his voice low and controlled. That was an authorized medical intervention, he'd said. His hands had been shaking, though not from relief. You don't know this man's medical history. What if he'd vomited during the maneuver? What if your technique had caused internal bleeding? You could have been sued. This restaurant could have been sued. He was choking, Margaret had said. The voice she used was the one she'd perfected over 6 months, quiet, measured, without inflection. He would have lost consciousness in 30 seconds. That's not your decision to make. Pierce's jaw had clenched. You're a server. Not a doctor. Not a paramedic. A server. You serve food. That is the totality of your role here. Do you understand? Margaret had nodded. She understood perfectly. She'd understood the moment he realized she was competent at something beyond his authority to control. The moment he understood that her calm during that crisis, the way her hands didn't shake, the way her eyes stayed focused, the way she'd known exactly what to do, meant something about her background that didn't match the apron she wore. By Friday morning, the other servers were avoiding her in the break room. By Saturday, Margaret had heard the whisper that she was skimming tips. By Sunday, she'd seen Pierce talking to the kitchen manager, his hands moving in animated gestures, and later that shift, one of the sous chefs had mentioned, casual as anything, that inventory shortages were up, and wasn't it odd how Margaret's section always seemed to move the fastest? She knew what was happening. She'd seen it deployed before, though usually with more immediate viciousness. This was methodical. This was strategic. This was a man who'd learned somewhere that you didn't have to be loud to be cruel, you just had to be persistent. Margaret wiped down the table legs. She wiped them down on Monday too, when Pierce asked. And on Tuesday. And Wednesday. Each time he found something new. The bar stools needed polishing. The baseboards were dusty. Her section had been sat at 6:14 on Friday when she'd taken a bathroom break at 6:08. Couldn't she manage her own biology to coordinate with the restaurant's rhythm? By Wednesday of the second week, Margaret had learned to move smaller in the restaurant. To take up less space. To lean into the invisibility. 12 years of being the most competent person in every room had taught her to stand straight, to speak clearly, to occupy space like she deserved it. 6 months of Pierce had taught her the opposite. Smaller was safer. Quieter was wiser. Let him think he was winning. But she wasn't invisible to everyone. On Thursday at 12:19 p.m., the man with the scarred chest came through the door. He was in his late 50s, maybe early 60s, with grey threading through his dark hair like winter was creeping in at the edges. His shoulders carried the shape of someone who'd spent decades bearing weight, not fat, not weakness, but the particular kind of thickness that came from muscle that had been earned and maintained through discipline. His eyes were the color of storm water on a cold morning, and they moved across the dining room with a kind of assessment that made Margaret's breath catch. She knew that look. She'd trained that look into herself, and into others. He moved toward booth 7 without being seated by anyone. The torn vinyl seat that nobody wanted. Margaret found herself following him with the coffee pot before she'd even decided to move, before her conscious mind had caught up to the decision her body had already made. Coffee, she asked. The word came out automatic. Black. 2 sugars. His voice was quiet, with the precise cadence of someone used to being heard without needing to speak loudly. He was studying the menu, but Margaret knew he wouldn't be ordering from it. He never did. She poured his coffee. He watched her hand as she did it, not looking at her face, but watching the way her fingers held the pot, the steadiness of her wrist, the precision with which she poured to exactly 3/4 full. His jaw tightened a fraction. It was the smallest tell, the kind of thing you only caught if you'd been trained to see it. Same as last Thursday? Margaret asked. She already knew the answer. Canna soda. Black beans. Extra lime. He folded the menu closed and handed it to her without looking up. How long have you worked here? The question was simple. Direct. Dangerous. 6 months, Margaret said. And before that? Margaret's hand stilled. Just for a moment. Just long enough that if he'd been watching her hands, he would have seen it. She thought he had been watching her hands. Other things, she said quietly. I'll get your order in. She moved away before he could ask another question. The restaurant smell of cilantro and lime suddenly felt different, thinner, like the air had been rearranged. Margaret delivered his order to the kitchen, where the sous chef grunted an acknowledgement and Pierce, who'd been reviewing invoices at the office desk visible through the kitchen window, looked up. Their eyes met for exactly 1 second, and Margaret saw something shift in his expression. Recognition. A realization that she was paying attention to the man in booth 7 in a way that mattered. What happened next didn't just change the rhythm of that Thursday. It started a reckoning neither of them could have predicted. But that would come later. For now, Margaret returned to the dining room where the man sat in booth 7, drinking black coffee with 2 sugars, and watching her with the kind of focus usually reserved for soldiers assessing an incoming threat. She pretended not to notice. It was better that way. It was safer. It was the longest she'd managed to hide in 6 months, and she wasn't about to break that now. Not yet. The Monday staff meeting started at 5:15, before the dinner rush, when Rosa's Cantina still smelled like cilantro and fresh lime instead of grease and salsa. Gerald Pierce stood at the front of the cramped back office with his arms crossed, his tailored shirt already darkening with sweat at the collar. 12 servers and kitchen staff crowded in, confusion rippling across their faces. Margaret stood alone near the walk-in cooler, the industrial cold radiating against her back. This, Pierce announced, his voice carrying the sharp edge of someone who'd practiced the cruelty beforehand, is what happens when you think you're better than your station. He mimicked Margaret's voice, soft, authoritative, the calm certainty of someone who'd held lives together in places no one in this room had ever seen. Sir, lean forward. I'm going to perform the Heimlich. His mockery was surgical. He deepened his tone, let the professionalism drip like poison. She's a waitress. Not a doctor. Not a nurse. A waitress. Call 911 and stay in your lane, Nurse ratched. Laughter rippled through the room like a contagion. Margaret watched her co-workers, servers she'd trained, dishwashers she'd covered for during their kids' emergencies, laugh on cue like trained animals. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, indifferent. Pierce's smile widened. He was testing something. Measuring how much pressure it would take. Margaret took one measured breath. Her jaw didn't clench. Her hand stayed flat against her thighs. She let a single tear escape, the kind that comes from anger, not from breaking, and she wiped it away without ever looking down, without ever giving him the satisfaction of her voice cracking or her eyes going soft. Your cruelty, she said, her voice the color of winter steel, says more about your character than mine ever could. The silence was instantaneous and absolute. The kind of silence that makes you aware of your own heartbeat. Pierce's face reddened in stages, first his neck, then his jawline, then the sharp line of his cheekbones. He looked like a man who'd thrown a punch and watched it pass through empty air. His mouth opened. Closed. He turned away, muttering something about attitude problems as he stalked toward his office. Margaret walked out before anyone could see what composure cost her. By Wednesday, the poisoning had begun in earnest. Pierce worked the kitchen staff with the precision of someone who'd studied how to dismantle a person without leaving marks. He blamed missing inventory on her section, 2 cases of lime, a full bottle of premium tequila, half a dozen steaks that had never made it to her tables. He said her name in the kitchen the way you'd say a curse word. Check Margaret's numbers. She's probably skimming. By Friday, 3 of the kitchen crew wouldn't meet her eyes when she placed orders. The other servers got the treatment too. Pierce told them Margaret was unreliable, that she'd tried to take credit for that choking customer save, that she was the reason inventory was hemorrhaging. The rumor evolved like a virus, skimming tips, lying on timecards, deliberately short-ringing tables to pocket the difference. Nothing proved. Everything plausible. By Thursday evening, servers who'd been friendly were taking breaks when she arrived, clustering in the storage room until she'd moved past. Margaret didn't defend herself. There was no defense that didn't expose her mission. No explanation that didn't raise questions about why she cared so much about Colonel Davies' recovery, why she monitored his medication schedule, why she'd been photographing delivery manifests on her phone when she thought no one was watching. The real trap came Friday during the dinner rush. Michael arrived at 5:47, still in his Army ROTC uniform from his high school, the blue polo shirt crisp and new, his name tape perfectly aligned. He was a lean 17-year-old with his mother's dark eyes and a confusion lately that cut deeper than any insult Pierce could construct. He took a seat at a corner booth, texted her a greeting emoji, and waited while she finished a round of drinks. Margaret was reaching for ice at the soda fountain, the deep well model that hissed when you pulled the lever, when Pierce materialized beside her, positioned perfectly so Michael could see everything. The dinner rush was in full swing. 30 tables occupied. A dozen eyes within earshot. "You know what you are." Pierce's voice was quiet, which somehow made it worse. Quiet meant he believed what he was saying. A washed-up nobody playing dress-up. "What did you do? Take some online course? Get a certificate from a strip mall? Did you watch some YouTube videos and think you were Florence Nightingale?" Margaret's jaw tightened. Her hands kept moving, the ice scooped, the cup positioned, the lid snapped on with a kind of mechanical precision that came from 1,000 repetitions. She could feel Michael's eyes. She could feel the weight of his confusion. "One more time you overstep your role, I'm calling security. You'll be escorted out in front of everyone. You understand me?" Pierce stepped closer, his cologne sharp and chemical, his presence meant to crowd her. "You're just a waitress, Margaret. That's all you've ever been." She said nothing. She couldn't say anything without revealing the mission, without explaining that she wasn't actually invisible, that she was one of the most trained personnel in her field, that the scar tissue under her uniform marked her as something altogether different than the person he was trying to destroy. Michael's face had shifted, confusion deepening into something like hurt. Like he was watching his mother absorb an insult that should have been impossible for her, and he couldn't understand why she took it. Behind them, in booth 7, Colonel Davies lowered his menu. His eyes were sharp, watchful, the eyes of a man who'd learned to read threats in milliseconds. He was a graying army ranger with combat wounds still healing beneath his cardigan sweater, and something in his gaze suggested he saw exactly what was happening and understood that Margaret was choosing not to fight back. That the restraint itself was information. Pierce walked away, satisfied. He turned her own son against her. That was the genius of it. Margaret delivered Michael's order, a burger, no onions, extra fries, the way he'd liked it since he was 6, and he thanked her with the politeness of a stranger. When she asked about his day, he gave one-word answers. His eyes kept drifting to the floor, to his hands, trying to solve a puzzle his mother wasn't going to help him understand. On Monday, Pierce made 3 phone calls in his office with the door cracked just far enough that Margaret could catch fragments. His voice was clipped and authoritative, the voice of someone who understood institutional power. She heard corporate policy, unauthorized medical procedures, liability concerns. She heard next available Monday schedule, and then his laughter, sharp and victorious. He was good at this. That was the terrifying part. He wasn't just a bully. He was systematic. Strategic. He'd reassigned her best sections to newer servers, the Friday night tables where tips ran high and regulars left their cards. He'd altered her schedule to reduce her Thursday shifts, the night Colonel Davies came without fail. He'd restricted her access to the back offices where the delivery logs were stored, the ones she'd been quietly photographing on her phone between shifts. Margaret felt the walls contracting. Her 6 months of surveillance, the careful documentation, the pattern analysis, the trust she'd built with Davies, all of it was being systematically dismantled by a man in a tailored shirt who'd never spent a day in uniform, who'd never held someone's life in his hands while artillery shook the ground. That evening, Michael asked about her limp. She'd forgotten to hide it, caught on a sharp corner near the walk-in as she pivoted too fast. "Mom, are you okay?" "Just tired," she told him, and he looked at her with eyes that said he knew she was lying, that he was old enough to understand his mother was keeping secrets that cost her something, and that confused him more than anything else. Margaret sat at the kitchen table long after Michael went to bed, her phone dark, her mission parameters crystallizing in the silence. 6 months of work. A black market prescription ring operating through San Antonio VA networks, the distribution hub suspected to be exactly where she was working, connected to Pierce in ways she still needed to prove. Colonel Davies recovering from Bagram wounds, Michael's commanding officer, a witness to the exchange network she was documenting. And now Pierce, methodical, competent, and tightening his grip, preparing to force her out before she could gather the final evidence. The fear wasn't personal. It was operational. She'd survived worse. But the cost of survival this time involved watching her son learn that his mother was someone he didn't recognize, someone who could absorb cruelty without fighting back, someone whose silence looked like weakness when it actually required the kind of strength that broke people who didn't understand what they were seeing. She pulled up her phone and reviewed the photographs, manifests, signature pages, pill counts that didn't match inventory records. Enough to raise questions. Not enough to prove anything yet. And time was running out. Outside, rain began hammering the glass like applause for something she'd already lost. The rain stopped around midnight, leaving the streets slick and steaming. Margaret sat in her apartment at 2 in the morning, staring at the encrypted phone on her kitchen table, the one that didn't appear on any contract, the one only the Pentagon investigator had the number to. 6 months. She'd been undercover at Rosa's Cantina for 6 months, and in that time she'd catalogued every transaction, every conversation, every visitor who didn't order food. The phone buzzed once. A text from her handler, status on Davies. Medical deterioration noted. Priority 1. She closed her eyes and thought back to the recruitment meeting in the parking garage beneath Seattle General, where the Pentagon investigator had slid a folder across the hood of her car in the early morning dark. The prescription ring was moving 40,000 pills a week through VA networks across Texas. Fentanyl, oxycodone, morphine, pharmacy-grade pharmaceuticals destined for the street. The investigation had been stalled for 8 months until they discovered the connection. Colonel Davies, Army Ranger, had been treated at the San Antonio VA Medical Center. His discharge paperwork had been accessed by someone at Rosa's Cantina. Someone with manager-level access to delivery schedules and staff routes. Someone like Gerald Pierce. But Davies was more than a witness. He was her son Michael's commanding officer from Bagram. He was the man who'd kept Michael alive through 2 ambushes and a collapsed building extraction. He was the reason Margaret's son came home with scars instead of a folded flag. When the investigator explained the assignment, there was no hesitation. Margaret had taken the waitressing job at Rosa's Cantina not to expose Pierce, not yet, but to monitor Davies' recovery from the blast wound that had nearly killed him at Bagram. 3 surgeries. Repeated infections. The kind of wound that makes a man vulnerable, that makes him a target for those who wanted to exploit his pain for profit. The first Thursday, Davies had arrived at Booth 7 wearing the uniform of someone who didn't belong in daylight anymore. His left side favored. His breathing shallow when he thought no one was watching. Margaret had served him water, and his eyes had flickered with something, not recognition, but the ghost of it. He'd served under Captain M. Walsh, Army Ranger Medical Corps, 5 years ago. A woman who'd extracted 12 wounded soldiers from a collapsed building in Jolin District under sustained enemy fire. A woman who'd disappeared from the active roster 3 years ago without explanation. He didn't know that woman was now wearing a black apron and carrying his soup course. For 6 months, Margaret had built her cover meticulously. She showed up early, worked doubles without complaining, let Pierce berate her without breaking. She let the other servers dismiss her as invisible. She let herself become background noise, the kind of person nobody notices because she doesn't want to be noticed. But every single day, she documented the pharmaceutical delivery trucks that arrived on Tuesdays and Thursdays. The way certain staff members had encrypted conversations in the back office. The pattern of cash handoffs disguised as tips, tracked through the register at precise intervals. The way Pierce's phone lit up with coded text messages, Angel Wings confirmed and Valkyrie route clear and Davies package moving Friday. She'd reported everything to her handler through dead drops in the parking garage of a Mexican grocery store on South Flores Street. Photographs. Timestamps. Audio recordings made from the server station when Pierce thought she was refilling napkin holders. The investigation was narrowing. The arrests were coming. But the timeline was compressing, and Davies' health was deteriorating faster than anyone had predicted. The wound from Bagram was bleeding again. Margaret had seen it in the way he moved last Thursday, in the slight grimace when he sat down, in the sweat that appeared on his forehead despite the restaurant's struggling air conditioning. Combat wounds didn't just scar over, they wept, they infected, they remembered the violence that created them. She'd calculated the odds silently while pouring his iced tea. Internal bleeding was a real possibility. His body was a wounded animal, and wounded animals didn't survive without intervention. She'd sent the health assessment to her handler in coded language, package condition critical. Window closing. Recommend acceleration. The response came back within an hour, maintain surveillance. Do not intervene. Federal timeline is 8 days. Davies is secondary to primary objective. Secondary. Michael's commanding officer was secondary. Wednesday morning, Margaret went through her usual routine, clocked in at 10, reviewed the day's section assignments, tied her apron with the careful precision of someone who'd worn uniforms in 12 different countries. Under her shirt, against her ribs, she wore the faded unit patch that had been sewn into the lining of her combat jacket from Bagram, the only piece of her old life she'd brought to San Antonio. When she touched it during her shift, feeling the rough embroidered edges through the fabric, it was a reminder she was still Captain Margaret Walsh. The apron was temporary. The restaurant was temporary. The waiting game was temporary. Pierce appeared in the kitchen doorway around 11, his expression carrying the small satisfied smile he always wore when he'd thought of new ways to make her day miserable. He'd been testing her composure all week, escalating his comments, calling her just a server in front of customers, moving her to the slowest section, handing her the tables with the most difficult orders. It was classic psychological warfare, the kind designed to provoke a reaction, to make her crack so he'd have justification for firing her. He didn't know he was testing a woman who'd survived Kandahar. He didn't know her composure wasn't fragile, it was forged. Walsh. He snapped his fingers. Those napkins aren't going to fold themselves. She didn't look up from the table she was setting. 3 more minutes. I said now. Margaret placed the final napkin, creased it with deliberate precision, and turned to face him. Her eyes flat. Her voice measured. I heard you the first time. Not defensive. Not apologetic. Just a statement of fact from someone who'd made a choice about whether his urgency mattered to her. It didn't. His jaw tightened. He wanted her to flinch. He wanted her to apologize. He wanted the satisfaction of knowing he'd gotten under her skin. Instead, she simply waited for him to leave, which he did, but not before she saw the frustration flash across his face. He was competent at petty cruelty, but he was discovering that cruelty only worked on people who cared about the cruelty. Margaret had stopped caring about Gerald Pierce somewhere around hour 3 of her first shift. By Thursday, the heat had turned San Antonio into a pressure cooker. The temperature hit 96 degrees by 2 in the afternoon, and the restaurant's air conditioning wheezed like an asthmatic old man struggling for breath. Margaret had prepared for Davies' arrival the way a pilot prepares for a storm system, mentally running through scenarios, positioning herself to see his table without being obvious, mentally cataloguing the nearest phone, the quickest exit route, the distance to the kitchen. He arrived at 2:45, moving slower than last week. Much slower. His left hand pressed against his ribs when he thought no one was watching. He ordered his usual, chili relleno, beans, rice, iced water with lemon, and Margaret brought the water immediately, noting the tremor in his hand when he reached for the glass. Not pain tremor. Shock tremor. His blood pressure was dropping. She turned to leave, and that's when she saw Pierce watching her from the kitchen window, his expression calculating. He'd noticed her notice Davies. He'd seen the way her eyes lingered. And in that moment, Margaret understood what her handler hadn't said explicitly: the prescription ring investigation went higher than Pierce. There were cops involved. Maybe DEA. Maybe someone with enough power to know about her cover and keep that information locked away from the official channels. Pierce disappeared into his office. 30 seconds later, his voice crackled through the service radio clipped to her apron. Walsh, office. Now. She walked into the climate-controlled box where Pierce sat behind his desk, his posture relaxed, his expression holding the kind of certainty that came from knowing something important. On his desk was a folder. An actual physical folder, which was odd because everything else about Pierce's operation was digital. He slid it across the desk toward her slowly, like a card player revealing his hand. "You're done," Pierce said quietly. "Effective immediately. Your last paycheck is being processed. Security will escort you out in 5 minutes." Margaret didn't open the folder. Didn't need to. She already knew what it contained. Her real military record. Her medical credentials. Her classified DD Form 214 with her actual unit designation. Her handler had warned her this was possible, but the speed took her breath away, not because she was afraid, but because it meant someone very high up had just made a decision about her cover. "I'm not leaving," she said. Pierce smiled. "You don't have a choice. Unlicensed medical procedures, impersonating a healthcare provider, fraud. I have documentation that you've been practicing medicine without a license every time you touched a customer." His voice was soft, almost amused. "All I have to do is make one call to corporate, and you're not just fired. You're arrested." Margaret's hand moved to the unit patch beneath her shirt, feeling the rough edges through the fabric. The tremor wasn't fear. It was restraint. "That's not documentation," she said quietly. "That's extortion." Pierce's smile didn't waver. "Call it what you want. You have 5 minutes." The sweltering Tuesday arrived like a punishment. San Antonio's heat pressed against Rosa's Cantina despite the air conditioning struggling to compete, turning the dining room into an oven where the vinyl booths gleamed with condensation and the kitchen's exhaust made the air shimmer like something alive. The dinner rush built in waves, families arriving early to escape the worst of the heat, couples pushing tables together, the ambient noise rising from conversation to something closer to white noise. Silverware clinked. Orders called out. The Spanish-language radio station behind the bar played Nortino ballads that nobody listened to but everyone felt. Margaret moved through it all like she always did, invisible and efficient. Section 4 needed water. Section 6 needed their check. The bar needed 3 margaritas and a beer, stat. Her hands worked the rhythm without her thinking about it anymore. 6 months at Rosa's had worn grooves into her muscle memory that had nothing to do with being a waitress and everything to do with being someone accustomed to operating under pressure. Her uniform stuck to her back. A strand of hair had escaped the ponytail sometime around 5 o'clock. She didn't adjust it. Booth 7 was in the corner by the front window. Colonel Davies sat there like he did every Thursday, except this Thursday something was wrong. Margaret noticed it the way she noticed everything, not dramatically, but completely. His face carried a grayness underneath the tan that suggested something deeper than fatigue. His breathing came in shallow pulls. Sweat beaded across his forehead in a pattern that didn't match the restaurant's temperature. He was a man built like a pine tree, all straight lines and minimal waist, but his left hand rested against his ribs in the exact way that said pain was information and the information was bad. She'd seen him like this once before, back in Helmand Province, after a convoy hit an IED and nobody wanted to admit how much shrapnel was still embedded in his chassis. The chest wound from Bagram, the one that supposedly healed, the one that supposedly wasn't why he came to Rosa's every week to sit in a corner booth and stare at nothing. That wound was talking now. His breathing pattern shifted. His color deepened from gray toward something closer to ash. Margaret kept moving. She'd learned long ago that the most dangerous thing you could do was draw attention to someone in crisis before the crisis became unavoidable. Attention meant questions. Questions meant complications. She was retrieving a water pitcher from the back station when it happened. The sound came first, not loud, but the specific quality of a body losing the argument with gravity. A soft collapse, the vinyl booth absorbing most of the impact, but unmistakable to anyone who'd heard it before. Margaret had heard it plenty. The water pitcher continued its path to the sink without interruption. She was already moving toward booth 7 before her conscious mind caught up with what her body already knew. Colonel Davies was sliding sideways, his face a map of something breaking internally. His hand clutched his ribs. His breathing had stopped being breathing and started being something closer to drowning that happened to be occurring in air instead of water. The booth's vinyl seat was stained dark where blood was doing work underneath the skin that blood had no business doing. The kitchen staff froze. Martinez, carrying a tray of enchiladas verdes, simply stopped in the middle of the dining room. One of the newer servers, a college kid named Evan, stood with his mouth open like someone had asked him a question in a language he didn't speak. The busboy backed away slowly, the way prey animals move when something larger notices them. Dr. Pierce emerged from his office like he'd been waiting for an excuse to be angry. His entire posture arranged itself into something resembling command. "Don't touch him," he barked, his voice carrying the particular quality of someone who'd watched enough corporate training videos to mistake policy for wisdom. "Nobody moves. Call 911. Now. Step back, everybody. We cannot have liability issues. This is a customer medical situation, which means we observe from distance and we document everything." He was already pulling his phone from his pocket, probably composing the mental narrative of how this wasn't his fault, how the protocols were followed, how nobody could say he didn't handle this correctly. Margaret had stopped listening somewhere around "don't touch." The counter separating the server station from the dining room was a barrier, and barriers were suggestions to people who'd been trained by the Army Ranger Regiment to view obstacles as opportunities. She vaulted it without using her hands, her body moving with the kind of precision that came from 100 combat extractions, 100 situations where hesitation meant someone didn't make it home. Her hands were on Colonel Davies's chest before anyone could formulate an objection. Her fingers found the surgical landmarks, the second rib, the midclavicular line, the space between the ribs where blood was collecting in a place it absolutely should not be. His breathing was becoming gasps. His pupils were already dilating. Internal hemorrhage. Possible hemothorax. The body's way of saying that whatever the surgeons had patched up 2 years ago in a field hospital in Bagram had held until it couldn't hold anymore. "Sterilize a steak knife," she called out, her voice dropping an octave from what these people had ever heard from the invisible waitress. "Now. Clean towels. Ice. Get me gauze and call the ambulance back. Tell them internal bleeding, possible hemothorax, we're performing emergency intervention." Her hands never stopped moving. They assessed, they measured, they found the pressure points with the kind of certainty that came from holding too many lives together in too many places that didn't have hospitals. Someone thrust the knife toward her. It was Martinez, moving with the kind of instinct that suggested he understood something fundamental about what was happening. Margaret took it without looking away from Davies's face. She could see the moment his brain registered who was doing this, the moment his eyes found hers and some ancient code between soldiers said everything that needed saying without language. The incision came clean. No hesitation. No tremor. Just the particular sound of precision, with a slight resistance of skin, then the deeper work. The vinyl booth seat became a medical theater. Blood soaked her uniform, warm and wet, and she kept working. Her fingers found the bleeder, the source of the hemorrhage, the vessel that had decided today was the day to stop cooperating with the body's architecture. "Pressure here," she called to Martinez, positioning his hand. "Ice on the wound. Elevation. Someone get me pressure bandages." Her voice carried through the restaurant with the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The college kid moved. The busboy moved. The kitchen staff moved. Colonel Davies's breathing steadied. Color began returning to his face in increments. The crisis, which had announced itself with the violence of something biological asserting dominance, began to concede ground. His eyes locked on hers, and whatever passed between them in that moment was written in the language of people who understood that the difference between living and dying sometimes came down to whether someone had been trained to do the hard thing when the hard thing needed doing. But that wasn't the moment everything changed. The moment everything changed came approximately 90 seconds later. Dr. Pierce had been standing frozen, his phone slack in his hand, watching something happen that his corporate training videos had not adequately prepared him for. A waitress performing emergency thoracotomy on a vinyl booth seat with restaurant silverware was not a scenario covered in his for-profit management certification. His face had cycled through several colors, red, then white, then a particular shade of purple that suggested his brain was performing calculations rapidly and arriving at conclusions that did not favor his professional reputation. He moved with the decisiveness of someone who'd finally processed that reputation preservation required immediate action. His hand closed around Margaret's shoulder. Not gently. Not casually. With the weight of institutional authority behind it. "Stop," he said. "Step away from that customer. Immediately." Margaret didn't look up. Her fingers were still working. "He needs 90 more seconds." "You heard me." "Off." His grip tightened. He wasn't asking anymore. He was the manager, and the restaurant was his domain, and a waitress performing unauthorized medical procedures was a liability cascade he could quantify in real-time legal exposure. The ambulance siren was audible in the distance when Pierce physically pulled her back from the booth. Not violently, but with the kind of methodical force that suggested he'd considered the implications and decided they were worth the risk. Margaret's hands came away from Colonel Davies' chest. Her medical work transferred to the paramedics who arrived 3 minutes later, professional and efficient, taking over a stabilization that Margaret had bought them time to continue. Pierce's next actions were swift and surgical in their own way. He reassigned Davies' booth to Martina's without explanation. He made 3 phone calls, his district manager, corporate legal, someone whose name Margaret didn't catch, and his voice was very calm during all of them, very measured, very careful about the language of liability and unauthorized practice and endangerment. He'd learned something about bureaucracy, about how to weaponize policy, about how to transform an act of salvation into a regulatory violation that no amount of explanation could undo. The schedule on the back wall was altered in red marker within 20 minutes. Margaret's name, which had been there in neat block letters for 6 weeks, was simply erased. All remaining shifts disappeared. Gone like they'd never existed. Dr. Pierce emerged from his office with a complaint form already filled out in his precise, bureaucratic handwriting. Unauthorized medical procedures. Endangerment of customers. Impersonating licensed personnel. He placed it on the counter where she could see it. His smile was very thin. "Clean out your locker, Ratched. You're done." The words landed without inflection, which somehow made them heavier. She didn't respond. The paramedics were securing Colonel Davies to a stretcher. The dining room had gone quiet in the way that restaurants go quiet when something real and urgent has just occurred and everyone is processing the implications. Her uniform was soaked in blood and saline and the residue of something that transcended workplace protocol. That evening, Margaret sat at the kitchen table in the small house she shared with Michael, still wearing the blood-soaked, cell-sustained uniform. She hadn't moved to shower or change. She'd simply driven home and sat, her hands folded on the table, her eyes focused on a point somewhere beyond the wall. The evening news played quietly on the television in the living room. Outside, San Antonio's heat was finally releasing its grip as the sun disappeared. Michael found her there at 7 o'clock, his school backpack still slung across one shoulder, his homework unfinished, his confusion visible the moment he registered the state of her uniform and the particular quality of her stillness. "Mom," he said. "Why are you home early?" She had no answer that wouldn't reveal the truth. She had no words that could explain 6 months of surveillance and classified missions and watching a man she respected slowly deteriorate because she couldn't be seen saving him without consequences. She had no language for the way the system worked, how it protected itself, how it could transform an act of mercy into a firing offense. She reached for her son and held him, the blood on her uniform transferring to his shoulder, neither of them speaking, both of them understanding that something fundamental had just collapsed and they were standing in the rubble of it. The ambulance, meanwhile, was traveling the 10 miles to Seattle General with a man who'd spent the last 6 months getting worse and the next 3 minutes getting better, all because a waitress had understood the exact angle of incision required to save his life. In the back of that ambulance, as Colonel Davies drifted in and out of consciousness, he whispered a single word that the paramedics didn't understand but that someone, eventually, would. "Valkyrie," he said into the fluorescent lights. The moment Margaret's blade found the bleeder, the moment her fingers understood what they were doing in a way that transcended training, Gerald Pierce made his choice. He didn't freeze. He didn't panic. He moved with the same calculated precision that had built his operation, and that precision was infinitely more dangerous than fury would ever be. He pulled her off the floor mid-crisis, his hand gripping her elbow with the kind of firmness that was plausible deniability, a manager protecting his establishment, not sabotaging a life-saving intervention. The reassignment was immediate. "Section 6 is now Johnson's," he announced to the remaining servers, loud enough that the entire dining room heard it. Margaret didn't argue. She already understood what was happening. The sound of her shoes on the tile floor as she stepped away from Colonel Davies felt like the closing of a door that couldn't be opened again. Pierce moved to the kitchen, past the sizzling planks of carne asada and the smell of cilantro and lime, and made his first phone call. His voice was level, professional, weaponized by bureaucracy. "This is Gerald Pierce, manager at Rosa's Cantina in San Antonio. I need to document an incident involving a staff member who performed unauthorized medical procedures on a customer." He paused, listening. "No, she's not a licensed medical professional. Yes, she used a serrated knife. Yes, she made physical contact with an open wound." The words were true enough, positioned in a sequence that transformed heroism into liability. His second call went to corporate legal. His third went to his district manager. Each conversation was a brick laid in the wall he was building around her actions. Each call created a paper trail that moved with the efficiency of someone who understood institutional power the way a surgeon understands anatomy. By the time the ambulance pulled away from the parking lot with Colonel Davies' stabilized vitals, Pierce had filed 3 formal complaints. Unauthorized medical procedures. Endangering customers. Violation of health code protocols. The complaints were technically accurate, carefully worded to avoid any phrase that could be construed as acknowledging that Margaret had saved a life. They were simply documents stating that a non-credentialed employee had performed an intervention that exceeded her authority. The genius of it was that he was right. She had violated protocol. She had endangered the customer in the eyes of corporate liability, right up until the moment that customer's heart stopped beating without intervention. But Pierce had learned long ago that truth existed on a spectrum, and the right positioning of facts could incinerate a career. The schedule alteration came next. Margaret checked her phone at 7:15 that evening, still wearing the uniform stained with Davies' blood and the salsa that had marked her invisible for 6 months. Her next 4 shifts had been deleted. Her name had been removed from Thursday evening, Davies' standing reservation time. The schedule reset showed no reason, no notation. Just absence. Just erasure. The efficiency of it was almost beautiful in its cruelty. Pierce had understood that the most effective sabotage required no public display. No confrontation. No moment that could be cited as wrongful termination. Just the slow reduction of hours until she had no choice but to leave, or until the investigation that was about to arrive would find her already gone, her credibility weakened by the paperwork he'd filed. But what Pierce didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that his phone calls had not arrived at the ears he intended them to reach. Corporate legal had flagged his complaints for review. The district manager had cross-referenced them with something in his files. And somewhere in the encrypted communications between federal investigators and Seattle General's compliance department, every word Pierce had spoken had been recorded, analyzed, and filed in a case file that bore Margaret's real name and clearance level. The Pentagon investigator who had been monitoring the prescription ring operation through the VA network had been copied on Pierce's complaints automatically by corporate protocol. And that investigator, a woman who had spent 3 years tracking pill distribution through 17 states, had read Pierce's documentation of unauthorized medical procedures and felt something click into place. Margaret's hands were shaking as she drove home. Not from fear. From the particular kind of tremor that comes from held composure finally released, from 6 months of breathing through insults finally exhaled, from the moment she understood that everything she had built was collapsing. The drive took 18 minutes. The traffic was light. The radio played a commercial for a personal injury lawyer, and she laughed, one sharp bark of sound, because the irony was so perfect it could have been scripted. She had saved a life with her own hands, and now the paperwork said she had endangered him. She had exposed a criminal operation, and now the bureaucracy said she had violated protocol. She had given 6 months of her life to a mission, and now the mission was compromised because she had been visible for exactly 90 seconds. When she opened the front door of the small house she and Michael had rented in the northeast corner of San Antonio, she still wore the uniform. She hadn't stopped to change. Her hands were clean, she'd washed them in the restaurant bathroom with the kind of thoroughness that was habit, muscle memory from a decade of field medicine, but the uniform itself told the story that her composure wouldn't. She sat at the kitchen table. The light from the window was golden and late, the kind of light that made everything look temporary, and she put her head down on her folded arms and let herself break. Not loudly. Not with sound. Just the physical collapse of someone whose architecture had finally failed. Michael was home from school 17 minutes later. He found her like that, still in the stained apron, and his voice came small and confused the way a child's voice becomes when the adult they depend on has suddenly become fragile. "Mom, why are you home early?" The question was simple. The answer was impossible. She couldn't tell him about the covert operation. She couldn't explain the Pentagon or the surveillance or the prescription ring. She couldn't tell him that his mother wasn't just a waitress but a captain in the Army Ranger Medical Corps who had stepped away from active duty to protect him from the life that kind of service required. She couldn't tell him that everything he'd witnessed, her refusal to fight back, her acceptance of Pierce's cruelty, her quiet dignity in the face of humiliation, had been the deliberate erasure necessary for an operation that was now destroyed. She looked at her son and understood that she had lost something she couldn't measure. The 6 months of carefully constructed surveillance were gone. The documentation she'd gathered on the prescription rings operations was still valid, but her position inside that operation was compromised. The VA network investigation would proceed, but it would have to do so without the eyes and ears she had positioned inside Rosa's cantina. The intelligence she had gathered would still be useful to the Pentagon investigator, but it would take weeks to verify without her corroboration. And Pierce, calculating, methodical, competent Pierce, had just handed that investigator something more valuable than months of surveillance. He had handed her probable cause. What Margaret didn't know, sitting at that kitchen table with her son's confusion pressing against her like weight, was that the investigator had already begun cross-referencing the complaints against her record. 3 phone calls to corporate legal. A schedule alteration. Formal documentation of her actions precisely timed to her moment of greatest visibility. The pattern wasn't random. The pattern was professional obstruction of an active federal investigation, which carried sentences measured in years. The prescription ring operation had been sophisticated, but Pierce had made one critical mistake. He had tried to use bureaucracy to bury a soldier, and in doing so, he had documented his own crimes with the precision of someone who kept meticulous records. By the time the federal investigator picked up her secure line and made her first call to the Pentagon liaison at Seattle General, she already had enough. The medical supply deliveries that Pierce had falsified. The inventory counts that didn't match his official reports. The phone logs showing calls to the same pharmaceutical contacts that the VA network had flagged 6 months ago. The evidence Margaret had been gathering for half a year suddenly multiplied through the lens of Pierce's own documentation. He had tried to destroy her credibility with paperwork, and instead, he had created the foundation of a federal case. Margaret sat in the kitchen as the light faded. Michael asked 3 more times why she was home early, and each time she couldn't answer him. She just held him the way a soldier holds something precious, which was carefully, knowing that the moment of safety was temporary, that the world outside the small house in San Antonio was already moving, already shifting, already bringing consequences that she couldn't stop. The mission was compromised. Her cover was shattered. And somewhere in an office at Seattle General, someone was reading Gerald Pierce's own words and understanding exactly what they meant. If you've watched this far, you know what loyalty looks like when it's tested. It looks quiet. It looks like staying when you should run. It looks like protecting your child while protecting your country, and sometimes those two things can't be reconciled. Subscribe to see what happens when the Pentagon comes calling, because Margaret Walsh's real job was never serving dinner. It was serving something larger, and now everyone was about to find out what she'd been sacrificing all along.